Hello, welcome to Beachview, our podcast about all sorts of things and stuff.
Yes, and today we're doing a brief, informal history of role-playing video games, otherwise known as RPGs.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, this is a topic you could write a whole book on. Actually, there's probably multiple books written on this. And I find it interesting because role-playing games are some of my favorite video games, and I wanted to talk about it. Again, brief and informal, because I have not done a ton of research on this. It's just sort of off the cuff.
Well, also informal because I don't know a lot about the topic, so I'm ready to learn. So that's, another good reason why it's informal.
Yeah, and I've talked about some role-playing games on here before. It's, like I said, one of my favorite genres has come up in some current viewings.
Mm-hmm. I remember us talking about it before because I was like, what does that mean, RPG? So
Yes.
I know we had some discussion about it, but not like you said, it's kind of more like a current viewings, not like a whole discussion on role-playing games, I think.
Yeah. And today there's some of the most popular games are RPGs, and there's a lot of like RPG mechanics that are involved in a bunch of different games that have been very influential on the history of the medium and towards culture in general. So, Minecraft, the best-selling video game of all time, has some like RPG elements in it, for example.
I feel like Minecraft has been around for so long too.
I mean, 13 years, more than that actually, but
it feels longer to me. I never played it. I've just heard about it.
Yeah, well, again, best-selling game of all time, so.
Yeah, pretty cool.
But, yeah, so basically, role-playing games starts with tabletop games, sometimes called pen and paper games. The quintessential example of which is Dungeons and Dragons, which is still popular today, and for a long time has been, like, the role-playing game. And yeah, I mean, it wasn't the only one at the time, or, it has influence and stuff, but it quickly, like, breaks out as, like, the popular role-playing game. And a lot of early computer games are either, like, direct adaptations of it or based on it, like, basically people wanting to play Dungeons and Dragons, but on their computer.
Oh, okay.
And, yeah, so from that, what is a role-playing game?
Yeah. Let's get into that. Let's start with the basics.
Defining the genre. So, my definition would be, like, there's a sort of jokey comment that goes around about, isn't every game a role-playing game because every video game because you play, like, a character, that's, like, playing a role.
Oh.
But, that's, to answer that question, I think, again, brief, informal, I don't actually know the etymology of this. But I think it's like, for Dungeons and Dragons and games of that era, like it's more like you're creating a character to play as compared to like other board games. Like, you don't do that in Monopoly or like card games where you're not like a character,
Well, okay, so let's let me differentiate that. So like, okay, you're saying like Monopoly, you're like the thimble or the top hat or whatever.
Yes, yeah, you have a game piece, but
okay,
you're
it's
not
a game
like...
piece. Okay, not like a full character.
Yeah, I suppose you could if you wanted to, but...
Well, I mean, how are you like a full thimble character? I don't know, but okay, got you. So it's more like you're embodying this character in like a role-playing game, it sounds like.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and some people kinda aren't into that aspect of it, and that's gonna carry on into the video game aspect too. Some people are more into just the, like, systems part, like the raw numbers bit of it, and to me that is the other key part of role-playing games, is those systems that most of these games involve some sort of, like, numbers that involve character quirks. So you do things in the game, and your character gets little experience points, and those go towards making your character better at things. They get stronger and learn, new moves that they can do, and sometimes get new, like, equipment.
Okay.
That also, like, makes them stronger, and, it follows sort of a narrative arc that way, where you start off relatively weak, and your character ends up getting, like, really strong by the end of the thing.
Okay.
Yeah, and, these, like, Dungeons and Dragons is based on, like, fantasy literature, like, very influenced by Lord of the Rings.
Oh.
but, other genres get put into here relatively quickly. But a lot of what we're going to be talking about early on is fantasy stuff.
Okay.
Do you have any questions about the genre itself or the definition?
Yeah, because, okay, so after you said a lot of people will say that, like, every game's a role-playing game, because then I start thinking about, like, okay, just very basic, like, Super Mario, like, you're playing one of the characters, right? But how is that different than, like, what you would call, like, a traditional role-playing game?
Right, so, yeah. The thing about people saying, like, every game being a role-playing game, that's more of, like, taking the name of the genre literally.
Okay.
But, yeah, because, that is sort of a, like, you always are embodying a role when you play games where you play as a character. But,
Right.
usually, again, like, some of these are specifically meant to be on the, like, you're creating the character, and then sort
Okay.
of role-playing as the character.
Okay. Gotcha.
But, like I said, not everybody's there for that in the, like, original tabletop games, like Dungeons & Dragons,
Okay.
and that's also part of the later games where you have a set character you're playing as, and the role-playing's more of the mechanical aspects, the numbers and leveling up, and, your character getting stronger, and often that involves choices of how you're going to, how you're going to build the character.
Okay.
That's usually a big aspect of role-playing games, is, like, do I want to make them more of, like, a sword guy or a magic guy, or, do I want this ability or this ability?
Okay, and then here's another question. This is probably, like, I've never played these games. So when you're playing, like, a Dungeons and Dragons type of game, like, I know they have, like, people who, like, say get together every, like, once a week and play the game. Is it a continuous game? Like, do you keep the same role? Or is it,
Often,
like, different
yes.
every single time? Okay, gotcha.
You can do it like that, it just depends on
Okay.
But yes, often. Yeah. And, yeah, that's, like, again, video games are often trying to systematize in some way the, interaction of Dungeons and Dragons, though those are often single-player at first.
Okay.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
Yep, any other questions about the definition?
No, I don't think. I mean, I'm sure some will come up as we keep going, but go ahead.
Yeah. So, the video game side of the genre starts in the mid-1970s. I believe 1975 is the year a bunch of these come out. And these start with dungeon crawl games, or dungeon crawlers, which is, like, this is often something that happens in role-playing games like Dungeons and Dragons, which you, like, that's your main side of, like, activity, is you go into a dungeon and, like, there's a bunch of, like, monsters and treasures and stuff, and you want to, like, clear it out, and that's, like, the game.
Okay.
And this is, like, basically the most popular kind of early video game RPG.
So was it, like, a trend, like, in the 70s? You said a lot of them came out, like, 1975-ish, so, like, did one come out and just a bunch of others followed, or, like...
I mean, I don't know the full history of this, like I said. I've not played any of these games.
Gotcha.
Yeah, there's some called, like, Dungeon, or P-Edit 5, I assume I'm pronouncing that right. Or Moria. There's just,
a bunch.
Yeah.
I had no idea. I've only ever heard of Dungeons and Dragons, like...
But yeah, these early computer simulations, basically, of role-playing. Oftentimes you're, like, creating a character and, like, moving through the world, and you get to, like, crawl through the dungeon. It's basically like, what if I had Dungeons and Dragons on a computer? Mm-hmm. That's, like, a lot of the inspiration for this genre.
Okay. So, Dungeons and Dragons is, like, a board game.
No.
Okay. Okay. Like, it's not like a physical game. It's a computer game.
No. Dungeons and Dragons is a physical game. It's just not like, I suppose you
not
can
like
use
a board game. Okay,
but
I
that
see.
you don't, like, pull out a board.
Okay.
Usually.
That's all right. I don't know why, like, I'm picturing, like, it's probably from, like, shows or something. Like, I remember watching, like, was it like Riverdale or something, where they're, like, playing some role-playing game and it gets, like the characters, like, come to life or whatever. And I'm just picturing, like, a board, like, you pull out, like, a physical board.
Yeah,
but
you
that's
can
not the case.
do that, but that's not,
okay.
Like, yeah, a lot of times it's just, like, you're just sitting there, like, you'll have, like, papers near you to write down, like, your stats and stuff to keep track of that,
okay.
but it's, like, And you'll be like around a table and you'll like roll dice, but usually there's not like always a board aspect to it.
Gotcha. Okay.
Though sometimes there is.
I don't know why I was just picturing. Yeah, I was picturing like a Jumanji type situation. I have no idea. Okay.
Yeah, so we have these early games that keep going, like particularly dungeon crawlers into the 80s. So yeah. 1981 sees the release of the Ultima and Wizardry series, which become popular early RPGs, that also go on to become series that are like very popular. And these in particular are influential on a lot of the early role-playing genre. Also in the 80s, you have a bunch more dungeon crawlers. You get the release of a dungeon crawler called Rogue, which ends up becoming like a genre in its own right, called roguelikes. And the thing that distinguishes that is that like you have, rather than having like the same character going through something, it's all procedurally generated, and like if your character dies, you just come up with a new one. Oh. Some of the other dungeon crawlers did this, but some of them like particularly had save states, and you were meant to keep like the same character like you would in a role-playing game, but this becomes its own genre.
So, would you say it's like a sub-genre?
Yeah, well, a lot of roguelikes become their own genre and start abstracting away from some of the RPG parts. Some of them keep that.
Gotcha.
It's just notable to mention because this is like a very popular subgenre of games to this day. You also have a game from a different genre that ends up being influential called Colossal Cave Adventure, released in 1976, and ends up being the backbone of the adventure genre, but some RPGs start taking influence from it, particularly multi-user dungeons, also called MUDs, which are kind of the precursor to MMOs.
Wait, what's an MMO?
Massively multiplayer online games, which later becomes... We'll talk about it more later, but
okay.
Becomes like a huge genre. And I believe that really starts coming about in the late 70s, early 80s, and that's like sort of an offshoot. Many of them are role-playing games, like these early online games. And then we see the release of 1986 and 1987 Dragon Quest and Final Fantasy, which become long-running series in their own right, both influenced by some of the earlier American games, such as Wizardry and Ultima. So these are, American games, and they later influenced the Japanese developers for Dragon Quest and Final Fantasy. I'm sure you've heard of Final Fantasy.
Yeah, but I thought, is that like a football game?
No.
Wait, what's... I thought it was like, I'm thinking of fantasy football, aren't I?
Yeah.
Never mind. Scratch that from the record.
Alright. And these two represent at least what's commonly understood as like a separation between like Western and Eastern RPGs. Although people have since problematized that distinction. Like I just said, they were influenced by these American games, so,
Okay.
But these sort of set the tenor for a lot of Japanese-developed games, and these typically come out on consoles rather than computers, which most North American games kept coming out for computers.
Okay.
But one of the things this, establishes is turn-based combat. A lot of the early, stuff is more... Some of it's turn-based, some of it's more kind of real-time, and real-time becomes more common in computer games going forward.
Okay.
Though there are still some, real-time games and action RPGs that come about shortly after this, which is, a subgenre of the RPG that has action game elements.
Okay. So it's another kind of subgenre.
Yeah.
Interesting.
But, yes, these two series, Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest, come out and become very influential, and their sort of style ends up, they themselves release a bunch more games over the years, and that style becomes one of the default styles for the genre going forward.
Trendsetters.
As well as the Ultima series, which also becomes, really influential on a lot of, into the 90s games. Yeah, and then starting in the 90s, we start seeing isometric games, which all have like the same camera angle and you kind of click to move as opposed to the like older
Oh.
games, which a lot of them are like dungeon crawlers. You're like kind of locked to the perspective of the dungeon. And you see a lot of like, graphical advancements as the years progress. Like the NES jumping to the SNES has a lot more technical power and computers keep getting better. So
Yeah, I was going to ask about that because you would think, like, as we get through the decades, like, they're going to be, I would say, way cooler, like, graphics wise or capability, like functional aspects of it. So
yeah.
even though, like, it's kind of staying true to the genre, I guess, or having these little subgenres, it sounds like it's going to be, they're still advancing, in other words, right?
Yeah, yeah.
I got you.
The early games, like in the 70s and 80s, start off with like line art and maybe some like
Yeah.
ASCII stuff, and then gradually they start adding, the early console games are 8-bit, they start adding 16-bit and getting more graphical fidelity, and you can like show better like art and more technically detailed art.
So the ones that came out in the 70s, were those computer based?
Yeah, yeah, that's what we're starting with.
Okay. Well, my question is like, having like a personal computer wasn't like a huge thing then, right? So
Oh, so the first
how
ones
was
that
that?
come out on mainframes, yeah.
Okay. So like, I'm just curious, like how it got that popular if, like it's not somebody like sitting at home playing a personal computer, you know?
Well, I think a lot of it was people at universities will use
Oh.
their computer access to like boot up games.
Okay, so it's like I'm picturing like way back in the day where you used to have like computer labs at schools and stuff. So like you didn't have one in your room, but you had one where you could go and play. Okay,
Yeah,
that makes sense.
yeah, and
Gotcha.
also this is largely a pre-personal computer, so
Yeah. Yeah, that's what I was like. How did it get so popular? Like nobody had personal computer. Well, I say nobody, but it wasn't, I guess mainstream.
yeah, and I mean it pales in comparison to what it will get to.
Yeah, yeah. Interesting.
But yeah, early on, this is a lot of just like college kids, especially having access to just random, like having access to
Doing their
computers and
thing.
yeah,
Doing what college kids do best.
yep.
Play games. I'm just kidding.
But yeah, the 1990s see some like isometric games. Some popular examples are Baldur's Gate, which comes out in 1998, or Fallout, which comes out in 1997.
Hmm. Never heard of. Well, I think I've heard of Fallout. I don't know what it is, but it sounds familiar.
Yeah, well, the Fallout TV show just came out, and that series has
Oh.
continued throughout the years.
Okay.
You also see various attempts at like sort of more first person or third person like action games, adding that into the RPG sort of canon. An early example is the Elder Scrolls 1 Arena, which actually we've talked about on a former random YouTube videos.
Mm-hmm.
And that becomes a like part of the RPG. You also see a popular game like Diablo, which is an action RPG that's kind of more centered around like the loot and the mechanics side of things, and this becomes like its own subgenre. You also see a software meant for like making RPGs called RPG Maker, which first comes out in 1992. It like gradually grows in popularity.
So that's something that like anybody can use?
I mean, if you have access to the software, but that is existing in the background, but doesn't really like start popping up till the 2000s.
Okay.
In the JRPG space, in 1996, we see the release of Pokemon, which is part of
Oh.
a subgenre of monster taming RPGs, where instead of
Ooh.
like being the character being the main thing that like battles, you end up with your little monsters battling for you. And Pokemon goes on to become one of the best-selling anythings of all time.
Yeah, I mean, I'm familiar with that. Well, I can't say familiar, but like, you know what I mean.
Yeah, and it starts with an RPG, and the cornerstone is still the RPG. So
I didn't realize that. Like, I guess I never thought about that being an RPG. I mean, I guess I never really thought too far into it, obviously, but that's I wouldn't think that's part of the genre, but I don't, I've never really played it myself, so interesting.
Yeah. The late 90s is also when we start seeing the introduction of the MMORPG, which has like earlier roots in MUDs, like I mentioned. And that ends up being this like really big deal. 97 sees the release of Ultima Online, which is a continuation of the Ultima series, and 99 sees EverQuest, which becomes really popular as a game. Uh, yeah, also Final Fantasy VII comes out in 1997, and this is like a really big deal. It's an early 3D game, and it like has pre-rendered cutscenes. It's like a really big step up for sort of the graphical fidelity of games and like their storytelling using those graphics. And it's this like huge hit, still like massive in the video game space culturally.
So is that the first occurrence of 3D?
No.
Okay. I was gonna say, like, I
but
feel
it
like
is
that's been
in
around.
this era. Like, it depends
Okay.
on like what you want to define as 3D too.
Okay.
Like that's a
Because that's
whole
kind of like the
thing.
norm, right? Like now everything's 3D.
Not necessarily. A lot of games are still
No.
old
Okay.
2D throwbacks, and
Okay.
But yeah, this is during the era where 3D games like really start blowing up,
Gotcha.
and yeah, the Final Fantasy, the RPG genre gets involved, and they start making some 3D games. One offshoot of this is called the Immersive Sim, which starts coming from the RPG genre. And it's like sort of MO is like, what if you had a ton of different options for solving problems?
Oh.
And it really tries to simulate sort of like what, if you were placed in a situation, what if you had like a bunch of different options that were maybe sort of askew from normal RPGs, which will give you like a puzzle to solve, but it's mostly like you walking around and doing combat. This is like, okay, if you have a thing, let's give you multiple different solutions. And that comes out of the RPG genre. It ends up being very influential. And Ultima Underworld is widely known as like the first of these, but this becomes its own genre, and it's very influential going forward. And then we hit the 2000s where, this is a popular, but I wouldn't say the most popular genre of game. There's a ton of different RPGs, both like on consoles and on computers. And one of the things that starts happening in the 2000s is the release of computer RPGs onto consoles. This happens for computer games in general.
Okay.
Like 2003 marks the release of both The Elder Scrolls 3 Morrowind and Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic, both of which come out on the Xbox, which end up being like the introduction of the computer RPGs onto console. A lot of computer games at this time start coming onto consoles as well. This is like sort of a like move from the two like computer video game space and the console video game space have been kept largely kind of separate.
Yeah. So when you say like a lot of them moved on to console, did they continue their computer based?
Yeah, they were simultaneously released.
Okay, so you could do either one.
Yeah.
Okay.
But that does end up having like differences because a computer can do different things than a console. Like a mouse has a different variety of movement.
Right.
So there are certain like aspects like the way you control it, and they also like simplify the amount of buttons you have because you only have so many on a console.
Gotcha.
Yeah, we see those two. 2004 sees the release of World of Warcraft, which becomes hugely popular. There are other MMOs in this time, but World of Warcraft like basically blows them all out of the water and becomes like the defining MMO.
Now I definitely heard of that one.
Yeah. And it like basically every MMO afterwards wants to be World of Warcraft because of its success.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was like a huge, I don't remember. Like what year did you say that was?
2004.
Okay. I don't know why I would know that, but I guess I just heard about it all over the place at the time.
Yeah. And during this era, a bunch of the more like console Japanese developed RPG style kind of starts falling out of favor, at least in like popular
Oh,
American spaces, although they've
interesting.
always had their fans. And again, like there is overlap between these, as people have gone back and pointed out. Knights of the Old Republic, like I mentioned, was looking at Final Fantasy VII
Hmm.
for there was like an interview with the developer where they talked about that, particularly like the cutscenes.
Okay.
And yeah, these are a popular game genre, but again, not the most popular by this point. Like shooters have basically totally overtaken them.
Shooters? What's that mean?
Like a game where you have a gun and you shoot things.
Oh, okay. That's what it sounds like. Okay. I thought it was like some technical name or like, some slang name for something.
No.
I'm like reading too much into it now.
Yeah, and of course, the Wii comes out and is like one of the most popular things ever, and that's not like known for being a huge RPG system.
Yeah.
Although, I'm not sure. Like during the early years of games, the RPGs were some of, I think, the most popular and prevalent genres. But I think like later on, it sort of like fades back into the background, and there are other genres that are more popular.
Okay.
At least for computers. There's always been like arcades, which weren't ever like RPGs.
Yeah.
Yeah, and going back to RPG Maker, that starts really blowing up in the 2000s, especially as, like, more and more people get the internet, and people are distributing their own RPGs through the internet, and games made with this often start dropping some of the RPG elements and become sort of exploration games or horror games made using the engine of an RPG. Yume Nikki is a popular one, and you've played that.
Yeah.
Yes, I had you play it.
I don't remember.
You don't remember the one where you're a girl that falls asleep and then walks around her dreams? It's a bunch
Oh
of, like,
yeah. Oh
abstract
yeah.
imagery.
Okay. That's right. I didn't remember the name. What's it? Say it one more time.
Yume Nikki?
Yume Nikki. Okay,
I
yeah, I
believe
didn't
that's how
remember
you
the name of
pronounce
it.
it.
I was
It's
like, I played
Japanese.
that? Yeah.
Yeah, but this becomes sort of a, while not technically an RPG, it is made in RPG Maker. So,
Oh.
it kind of similar. I just think that's an interesting offshoot that people start using the, like, engine of the, like, it's like basically, what if we took a Final Fantasy game and took out all the, like, combat and stats and stuff and
Yeah.
used it towards a different
Sure.
end?
Yeah.
Yeah, and the 2000s also sees, like, a big explosion in the video game industry, and you get a lot of different series developed. Fallout continues and becomes, like, a big deal. They get bought by a new company and developed in a new way. And they go from, like, isometric to a shooter with RPG elements.
Hmm.
The 2000s also sees the release of a subgenre of games called the clicker game,
What the heck is
or
that?
also sometimes like an idle game. So the original clicker game is a game called Progress Quest, which is sort of a parody of EverQuest, for being like it like strips away all the like, oh, okay, I don't even think this is a clicker game. I think it's just an idle game. But it's basically like, what if we took out all the game parts of a video game and just had the number go up part?
What?
So it's like you take the RPG elements where you get stats and stuff that constantly go up,
Okay.
and it's just the numbers going up.
So what do you like? What do you do in the game?
And this one, nothing.
Okay, you literally do nothing.
Yeah, and the
Okay.
number goes up. Some of them you click to make the number go up, and then once you get enough points, you can like use those points to purchase something that'll make the number go up by itself.
Is that even fun? Like, what's an
People
example
like
of
them.
that? Kind of? Yeah.
But yeah, this is like a weird subgenre that comes out of RPGs. It's basically like human psychology likes it when numbers go up.
It's like getting that dopamine.
Yeah, it's basically just like pure like dopamine without the sort of gameplay elements of this. I just thought that warranted a mention.
I feel like that would be like what little kids would play or something.
Nah, plenty of adults play them, like
No?
just to have them running in the
Wow,
background.
Okay.
I think it's less popular I think it's past its height, but this is a style of game that exists. And
So
it gets a
maybe
start
I'd be good at that.
from RPGs in the 2000s.
Okay. I wouldn't even think that would be related, but I guess, like you're saying, everything kind of evolves.
But yeah, again, in the 2000s, we get most RPGs are really into stories by this point. Um, you'll still see a few of the more dungeon crawly stuff that's more like a direct simulation of a tabletop game,
Okay.
where it's like you come up with the stuff in your head. But a lot of these games are much more story based by this period. Which, I mean, there were always story-based games. And of course, there's still some games based off of more directly off of tabletop games. But by this point, they're mostly influenced by each other, more so than their tabletop roots.
Gotcha.
But yeah, and again, graphics get more and more advanced during this period. We're full 3D by here. You still do get some more, like, throwback games. Like Pokemon doesn't go full 3D until 2013, so at least in their main series games. And again, there's a lot of like more interest in story, particularly using cutscenes to tell those stories. And yeah, these games become more and more popular as the industry as a whole grows. In the 2010s, we start seeing again, the MMORPG is fairly popular, and there's always some of those coming out. The Elder Scrolls V Skyrim releases in 2011, and that goes on to become one of the best-selling games of all time.
Oh.
Like I said, Minecraft comes out, and that has some RPG elements. During this period, you also start seeing a lot more RPG elements in other genres. One example is Borderlands, which is a first-person shooter series that comes out the first game comes out in 2009. But the Borderlands series continues that, and it's basically like, what if we took a lot of the loot and number systems from Diablo and put it in a first-person shooter, and a lot of other quasi-MMO games take influence from this sort of gameplay loop, like adding RPG elements to your game.
Okay.
Even if it is not itself an RPG. You also see a lot of indie games coming out during this period, and really starting to get big, some of which are RPGs. Some of which are, like, particularly throwback RPGs to either the old, like, taking influence from Rogue and being a roguelike, or taking influence from the older, like, 90s computer RPGs, or from the, like, 80s and 90s console RPGs.
Okay.
And there's, like, just a ton of these.
Well, I like how these developers can kind of recycle the same, like, premise, I guess, and just come up with new stuff to, like, release and keep things fresh. But I also like how, like, some of the original games that came out, like, in the 70s are still around today. Like, I think the longevity of that is just, like, crazy to me.
Yeah, also, as far as I'm aware, dungeon crawlers have never gone away.
Yeah.
They just, like, became a niche subgenre. And there's also games like the Kingsfield series that try to be like 3D dungeon crawlers. And that eventually becomes the Souls series, which starts with the release of 2009's Demon's Souls.
Ooh, that's scary.
Then the next game in the series sort of is the 2011 action RPG Dark Souls, which is extremely influential on the video game space going forward, to the point where there's a subgenre known as a Souls-like. Yeah, and that's like this whole sort of subgenre that develops out of here. Again, the video game industry grows a lot during this period.
Yeah.
Adds, like I said, RPG elements become super popular amongst a ton of games. Like I said, Minecraft has some in there. There's a lot of multiplayer games that start adding them, some for bad reasons, I think. Just because, RPG elements are kind of more compulsive than certain other genres, mechanics.
Makes sense.
That hit of dopamine humans like regular progress, even if it's kind of meaningless. Sort of a lesson learned from clicker games.
Yeah.
And again, like you see the rise of indie games during this period. Which actually I probably could have mentioned some earlier, like the RPG Maker games were indie games, but you also have like Flash games, which is this like whole sort of indie scene built out of Adobe Flash. that's like really popular for web games in the 2000s. Like these are all hosted online.
Okay.
And some of these are RPGs because, of course, people want to make games that are similar to stuff they like from consoles.
Sure.
Yeah, and again, some of these games end up going to sell really well because, the game industry's gotten so much bigger. They're, like, way more graphically intense. And a lot of them start streamlining during this period, sort of the, not exclusively, but a lot of the more popular games, compared to the earlier games in the genre, are a lot less heavy on the, like, numbers parts. And there's, like, more action influence.
Okay.
And more influence on sort of a, like, video game prowess as compared to earlier games, which are a lot more strategic. Though, the strategic games still exist, so...
Yeah, I feel like I would like that kind of better. Figuring out stuff,
And turn-based starts falling out of favor during this period. A lot of the turn-based games, like particularly Final Fantasy, start either trying to go full, like, action combat, or they start, like, kind of mixing up the turn-based elements.
I imagine turn-based, like, I guess it's like what people don't want to wait for their turn. Like, it's like is it that simplistic of a thing? Like,
well, turn-based games can get quite in-depth and quite strategic. It's just like this, there was a line of thinking at the time that turn-based was mostly a concession to, just computational power. Like,
okay.
you used an abstraction to simulate your combat because you couldn't really have the games like this and do anything else.
Okay.
And that became like a style, and some people really didn't like this style. They preferred the more, real-time elements of it. They felt that was more, like, realistic, or they just liked the gameplay paradigm better.
Okay.
But yeah, a lot of these series still continue into this, Final Fantasy's still around, Pokemon's still around, Fallout's still around, the Elder Scrolls still around. These are all, like, very popular games. Like I said, Dark Souls becomes, like, a absurdly popular series and, like, its own genre during this period. I wouldn't say there's too much different in the late 2010s from the early 2010s. Just, again, like, graphical fidelity increases, streamlining, and a lot of indie games come out doing a bunch of stuff with the genre. Some of them are more throwbacks, some are, like, trying new things.
Gotcha.
And yeah, I think there's probably not much different about the 2020s either in this space. I guess some of the bigger RPGs aren't very, like, development time takes so long in this era that, like, the Elder Scrolls 5 came out in 2011, there's still not an Elder Scrolls 6.
Oh, dang.
Yeah, so...
Are they just not doing it, or it's just taking
No, they
that
are.
long?
It's just, like, they also added another project, like a new series they wanted to make that took up time, but also it's just, like, because of increased graphical fidelity, like, games just take longer to make. And also, there's been a paradigm shift in the games industry as a whole, where they start wanting to go on to bigger games, rather than a lot of smaller games that you can release fairly consistently, and those take longer to make.
I see.
But yeah, so, I wouldn't say too much has changed from the 2020s. You still get a bunch of, these big games that have... I guess, you see less RPGs as pure RPGs. They start adding more elements from other genres and start streamlining a lot. But you still do have the sort of smaller developer and indie space that's, like, really big. And, you'll see RPGs get really big every few years. Like, Baldur's Gate 3 was one of the biggest games of last year, and that was, like, RPG, and a bit more old school in its, conception than some of the other games.
I like how it goes back around, like, some of these games have been out for years, and they're just, like you're saying, every few years, like, pop up again in popularity.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, Final Fantasy's, like I said, that came out in 87, so, that's, like, huge series, still very popular today. Pokemon became one of the biggest things in the world. That's from 96.
Jeez.
Yeah, so, these are some of the most popular games and game series of all time. I wouldn't say any of the games are, like, the most popular, but it is a consistent subgenre that still exists. And you will still see some, like, direct tabletop adaptations So, kind of going with its roots there as a genre.
Yeah.
And you'll see just all sorts of, old throwbacks and new ideas in the indie space, and just, it's still a popular force in mainstream video games.
Still going strong.
Yeah, that's my brief, informal, rambling overview of the history of RPGs. Any questions?
Well, no, I don't think so. I mean, I had no idea it went back that far. Like, I knew, like, I guess Dungeons and Dragons is the really only role playing game that like I really knew about.
It's also the most popular, so.
Yeah, the most popular, but I obviously have never like actually seen somebody play it, so I don't know much about it. Just have heard the name like a lot over the years. But I didn't realize it was like from the 70s. I had no idea it was that long ago, or that there were like all these different offshoots from that genre. So
Yep.
It sounds like there's always something new or some kind of advancement in an old game, I guess, that keeps people like hooked on it.
Yeah, and these games end up being, there's some of the earliest games in the 70s, and end up, really being some of the, like pushing forward what you can do with a PC or a console.
Yeah.
And, are very influential throughout the years in the video game industry, and some of them just in general. Like I said, Pokemon is one of the biggest things ever, so.
Yeah. Love that. Well, cool. I'll have to try one day.
You want to play a Pokemon game?
I'll have to play Pokemon one day. Yeah. Exactly.
But yeah, any closing thoughts there?
No. I don't know really enough about it to, have any other thoughts or concerns, but I think it's super interesting that, like I said, it's been around for that long and it's like still going strong. So, I feel like it's always going to be around,
Yep.
Yep.
All right. Well, that has been Beachview. Thanks for listening, and tune in next time. Bye.
Bye.